Today on All Sports Central, we're going to be going over my 2020 way too early rankings for the college football season. And just so you know ahead of time, these are way too early rankings for a reason. These will likely be inaccurate as we get towards the season, towards around August or so. So, with all that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started with 21 through 25. At number 25, we've got Baylor. They're coming off of an excellent season. They went 11-3, and overall, I thought they were going to be good, but I didn't expect them to be that good. Can they do it again is the real question for this team. That's how it is with most of these teams that are really good one year. Typically the next year they kind of die off a little bit. But they do lose their top running back in Hasty. They lose one on the offensive line. Nonetheless, losing only one on the offensive line really isn't all that bad, so they'll be pretty experienced. They lose two wide receivers, Denzel Mims and Chris Platt. Denzel Mims had over 1,000 yards, so that's going to be a pretty big loss. Platt only had about 300. But it's still a loss of a wide receiver. So for Charlie Brewer, if he's under center, of course, that's going to be a little bit tough to have to deal with. But nonetheless, I still think this Baylor team will be pretty good next season. I don't think they'll be as good as they were this year, but they'll still have a pretty good season. 24 is Boise State. They lose Jalen Henderson at quarterback, and he had over 1,000 yards. Hank Beckmeyer, sorry for pronouncing that wrong, but he had over 1,800 yards, and he will likely take over at quarterback. They lose three on the offensive line, return the top running back, Holani, who had over 1,000 yards rushing. And they lose their top wide receiver in Hightower, so that's kind of tough, but they return their second wide receiver in Shakir. Overall for Boise State, I think they'll be a little bit better next season. It's still really hard to determine, though. Once again, we're only like a week into the offseason. 23 is USC. They lose two on the offensive line. They lose one on the defensive line. They return freshman quarterback Slovis, who had 3,500 yards in his first season with USC or with any college team. So overall, he's got a ton of potential going into his second year. So, watch out for him. That's for sure in the Pac-12. Return their top they return their top running backs as well. They lose Pittman, who is their top wide receiver. He had over 1,200 yards. But in return, they do have their second wide receiver in St. Brown back. They've been a little bit down recently, though. Of course, last season was a little bit disappointing for this team. And then recruiting really hasn't been as good. This 2020 class for USC, if you've been following recruiting, really isn't all that great. But with the talent that they've got right now, I think they'll be pretty okay next season. 22 is Iowa, and it looks like they might lose three offensive linemen. That could change, though, of course. Once again, we are very early on. There's two defensive linemen and two linebackers. This defense has taken a bit of a hit. They've, of course, been known for their great defense. They do lose Nate Stanley at quarterback, another big hit. They return a ton of their top wide receivers and running backs. So, of course, the quarterback situation is going to be major for Iowa. If they can get a good quarterback to take over, I think they'll be just fine. But nonetheless, once again, that's really up for grabs right now. And we'll know more once we get to the spring who will be quarterback for this team. They do still have a lot of defensive talent, no doubt, even though they're losing a couple of players. But nonetheless, number 21 is Notre Dame. Quarterback Ian Book is gone for this team. He had over 3,000 yards. They lose their top running back in Jones Jr., lose their top wide receiver in Claypool. They lose an offensive lineman, two defensive linemen, and the secondary does take a big hit for this team, losing three. And this team has too many losses, I think. This season is going to be more of a rebuilding season for them. And from a lot of the polls that I've seen for way too early rankings, they actually have Notre Dame pretty high up. And that really surprises me, knowing all the losses that they have. I don't think they'll be as great next year. Number 16 through 20. At number 20, we got Virginia Tech. They return their their quarterback in Hooker, possibly running back McLeese. That's still up for grabs. They return most of their wide receivers, return almost everyone on their offense. They return their entire offensive line. On the defense, the only player that they lose is a linebacker. So Virginia Tech has got a ton of potential for next season. I think that Virginia Tech could very well be like a Baylor or a Minnesota this season. They've got a lot of potential with as many players as they're returning. When you return almost your entire defense, that is huge because they're working with basically the same defense 2 years in a row. And same thing for the offense. They're not really losing a whole lot at all. Watch out for Virginia Tech. Minnesota's my number 19. Can they do it again? Kind of like Baylor. Of course, they're kind of like one of those teams that typically do really good one year and they're not as good the next year. But of course, I'm a big fan of PJ Fleck. I think he's doing a great job with the program. No doubt the way he's been able to turn it around, it's been pretty impressive. Not gonna lie at all. Returned quarterback Tanner Morgan. They do lose their top running back Rodney Smith. Top wide receiver Tyler Johnson is gone, but they do return their second wide receiver in Rashad Bateman. So there are a couple losses there with Smith and Johnson. They return their basically their entire offensive line. They lose a defensive lineman a linebacker as well, and a couple in the secondary. So basically the biggest hits that Minnesota is taking is in the running back and wide receiver positions. But nonetheless, I mean, they're also losing a couple in the defense. So I don't think that Minnesota will be quite as good as they were this year. But they'll still be a good team in contention for the Big Ten West. Number 18 is really a team to watch out for. That is Tennessee. They had huge progression over 2019. And I think Tennessee's a little bit like the Nebraska of 2018. 2018 going into the 2019 season. I mean, they ended off their season really well, and they've got a ton of potential. It didn't really work out for Nebraska this year, but for Tennessee, who knows? It could be crazy great for Tennessee, honestly. I mean, Jarrett Garantano is likely to return. Running back Ty Chandler returns as well, same as Eric Gray. Top two wide receivers, Jennings and Callaway, are gone, though, so that's going to be tough to deal with. They combined for 1,500 yards. Lose two offensive linemen. Their tight end Wood Anderson. They lose two linebackers. So there are a lot of question marks for Tennessee. But I think they'll be pretty good this year. Number 17 is Michigan. They were more or less disappointing for me in 2019. I thought the Michigan could go on to win the Big Ten East. They had so much potential. I mean, with Shea Patterson, he was coming off of a great 2018 season. It was a little bit underwhelming for Michigan this year, not going to lie. And they've got a lot of question marks for 2020, of course, with Shea Patterson now being gone. They do return the top running back in Zach Charbonnet. That's big. Bright side as well is their top wide receiver, Ronnie Bell, returns. He had over 700 yards. And it looks like Nico Collins will return at wide receiver as well, but that's not for sure quite yet. They lose three offensive linemen, two linebackers, and their secondary takes a huge hit as well. So, nonetheless, this defense is certainly going to decline a little bit going into next year. And Michigan was able to get 9 wins this season. I don't think they're going to get 9. I think they'll probably get 8. I think that Michigan, and they could very possibly put Harbaugh on the hot seat after this season. But Michigan just cannot get over the hump. I mean, they've gotten 8 wins, 9 wins, possibly even 10 wins. But they just can't get over the hump of beating Ohio State. They can't get over the hump of getting the Big Ten championship. They just can't do it. And so for Michigan, it makes me a little bit doubtful for them in the future with Jim Harbaugh. But nonetheless, who knows? Who knows what can happen? It could be a great season for them. We're still very early on once again. Number 16 is Texas. This is another team that kind of disappointed me in 2019. I thought they were going to end up going to the Big 12 championship game. I didn't think they were going to win it, but I thought they were going to end up moving on to it, so it was a little surprising. But they do return Sam Ehlinger at quarterback. That's huge. Top running back Keontae Ingram returns too. Lose 2 offensive linemen, but the biggest hit for this team is Duvernay. He's their wide receiver. He is gone. He had 1,300 plus yards this season. So that's a very tough loss there. They lose Colin Johnson as well. Lose a defensive lineman and 2 in the secondary, 2 on defense. So overall for Texas, lots of question marks for this team as well. I'm not really sure how quite they're going to do, and you'll see in my previews how I think Texas is going to do later on. But I think Texas will be, they'll be up for contention for the Big 12 championship next season. I'm not sure if they'll get to it. I mean, especially with the losses that they've got. But if Sam Ehlinger can have a great season, I mean, the sky's the limit for Texas. Now, next up with 11 through 15. 15, we've got Iowa State. Iowa State was pretty disappointing in 2019, too. They returned quarterback Brock Purdy. He had nearly 4,000 yards for this team. He had a great year. And they also returned their top running back in Breece Hall. That's pretty big. Their top wide receiver in Jones, though, he is gone. They returned their second wide receiver in Milton, though, so that's going to be helpful. But losing their top wide receiver, that Jones guy, he's going to be tough to have to replace. They lose 2 offensive linemen, a defensive lineman, and a linebacker, though, too. So for Iowa State, it's gonna be tough to. It's going to be tough in 2020. I think that Iowa State will be kind of in the same situation as Texas. I think they'll be very similar to how Texas is and how they will be in 2020. North Carolina is a team that is going to be very tough to predict in 2020. They could either be great or they could be terrible. I'm not sure. But I think they're going to be great. I mean, they had huge strides in 2019 with Mac Brown. Returned freshman quarterback in Howell had over 3,600 yards. Now, it looks like their top running back in Carter will return. They will return Williams, who is their second running back as well, so the running back core is going to be great for this team. They return Brown and Newsome as well as their top 2 wide receivers. So yeah, lots of potential for North Carolina. They do lose an offensive lineman, 2 on the defensive line, and linebacker as well, though. So nonetheless, it could be a great season or a bad season for North Carolina. Who knows? But Mac Brown, all I know is that he's a great coach. Number 13 is Oklahoma State, and there's a ton of potential for this team, and a lot of polls that I've seen, they've got Oklahoma State pretty high, and I'm going to do the same thing. I think that Oklahoma State's got a ton of potential. They return the quarterback Spencer Sanders, return the top running back Chuba Hubbard, interesting name. They return their top wide receivers Wallace and Stoner as well, but Wallace is going to need to be healthy if Oklahoma State does anything crazy. Wallace was he was on injured reserve for a good chunk of the season with an injury. But they do lose 2 offensive linemen, but they return almost their entire defense. So this Oklahoma State defense will likely have one of the best defenses in the Big 12, no doubt. Number 12 is Wisconsin, and Jack Coan looks to return for this team. And overall, if you look back at this team in the offseason, I said if Jack Coan plays well for Wisconsin, I think this Wisconsin team will end up winning the Big Ten West, and that's exactly what happened. He played pretty well, and that was huge for this team. Top running back Jonathan Taylor is gone. That's going to be a huge hit. He had over 2,000 yards. They do lose their top wide receiver in Cephas, lose an offensive lineman. But the defense looks good overall. They do lose 2 linebackers. So for Wisconsin, they're also another team that I'm kind of uncertain about. Number 11 is Auburn. Bo Nix returns at quarterback. He's got a ton of potential. They return their top running back in Whitlow, top wide receiver Seth Williams as well. They do lose 3 offensive linemen. So the offensive line is going to be probably the biggest hit for this team. They lose defensive lineman and linebacker as well. The defense does take a couple hits. But overall for Auburn, I think it'll be more of a similar season to 2019 for them, which is a good thing. It was overall a pretty good year for Auburn. But if they can just get over that hump and possibly get to the SEC championship, that'd be huge for this team. I'm not sure if it's going to happen next year, but Auburn does have a ton of potential. Next up, 6 through 10. With number 10, we got Texas A&M. And if you remember back in the offseason with Texas A&M, I was like, if Texas A&M's got a ton of potential. And I still think the exact same thing going into 2020, but it was just a schedule for 2019 that was brutal for this team. Being in their division, the SEC West, and having to face the teams that they did, and especially, they had to play Clemson as their second game of the season, so that was brutal. But for Texas A&M, they had to play Auburn, Alabama, LSU, of course, since they're all in their division, so that was brutal. And then you have to add Clemson to that. Just a terrible, very, very tough schedule for Texas A&M, especially with all the talent that they had. If they were in any other conference, I think Texas A&M could have made it to their conference championship. But nonetheless, going into 2020, Kellen Mond does look to return. He had about 3,000 yards in 2019. They returned their top running back Isaiah Spiller. Their top wide receiver Osborne returns, as well as Davis, and their defense returns almost everyone. So once again, they got a ton of potential. Number 9 is Oklahoma. Jalen Hurts is gone for this team. He is their quarterback, and of course, Oklahoma's had a really good cycle of quarterbacks lately. Jalen Hurts. You also had Kyler Murray, and now Jalen Hurts. Baker Mayfield as well as that. You got to add him too. That's my bad. But they do return the top running back Kennedy Brooks. That is huge. They might lose their top wide receiver CeeDee Lamb to the NFL draft. Not quite sure on that yet. They do lose their third wide receiver in Lee Morris, though we do know that for sure. They return their second wide receiver in Stevenson, though, so that will be helpful. But once again, you're losing 2 of your other main wide receivers. They lose an offensive lineman, a linebacker, and a cornerback. So that's going to be tough to have to deal with. But I think Oklahoma will be just fine going into next season. And I think they'll be just right in there in contention for the Big 12 championship once again. Number 8 is Penn State, a team that I really think has potential to possibly make the college football playoff. Sean Clifford returns at quarterback. Journey Brown returns at running back. He had 800 yards. They return all their main wide receivers. So this offense could easily be one of the better ones in the Big Ten. They do lose an offensive lineman, but that's about it on offense, really. Their defense does lose 2 defensive linemen and a linebacker. So, overall, that's only like 4 starters that they're losing on both sides of the football. So, overall for Penn State, they've got a ton of potential. Number 7 is Oregon. They had big chances to do big things in 2019, and it was only one game that blew it for them. That was that Arizona State game, I believe. That just blew it for them. And it really sucks being in the Pac-12 conference. Especially, Oregon, I think they should have made it. Oregon had a ton of talent with Justin Herbert and CJ Verdell. This team had a ton of talent to deal with. They still have a ton of talent going into 2020 as well. I think their chances are going to be just as good to make it back to the Pac-12 championship and possibly even the college football playoff. We'll have to see. But nonetheless, they do return top running back CJ Verdell. Justin Herbert is gone, though. They lose Jawan Johnson, but they do return Johnny Johnson at wide receiver. They lose 2 offensive linemen and 2 linebackers as well. So there are a couple hits, but overall, Oregon still has a ton of talent. Number 6 is Georgia, and Jake Fromm looks to return at quarterback. That is huge. DeAndre Swift might return as well for this team. I think this team definitely is in contention for the College Football Playoff. It's just about their offense, though. If their offense can play well, sky's the limit for this team. They return their top wide receivers. They lose a top tight end in Charlie Werner. They do lose a defensive linebacker, and a safety as well, though. So for Georgia, they are taking a couple hits on defense, but overall for Georgia, I think they've got a lot of potential going into the season as well. It's going to be really interesting to see who comes out on top of the SEC this season as well. Of course, with LSU and Alabama and Georgia, and now Texas A&M. I mean, it's going to be interesting, that's for sure. Now going into your top 5. Number 5 is Florida. Kyle Trask returns at quarterback for this team. Their top running back in Perine is gone. He had about 600 yards. So overall, he wasn't used all that much, but that is still a tough loss at the running back position. And they return their top wide receiver in Jefferson and tight end Pitts. That's pretty big. And their defense does take a couple hits, though. That's where they're taking the most hits. They lose 2 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and a safety. So that's 5 starters that they're losing on the defense. And, well, nonetheless, I mean, though, for Florida, I mean, this offense definitely has a lot of potential. Kyle Trask, I really believe in him. He's done a really good job this season, especially with Felipe Franks, with him filling in. He did a great job. So it'll be interesting to see how he does in 2020. Number 4 is LSU, your national champion for 2019. And this is a really interesting team. Very tough to predict as well for 2020. Joe Burrow is gone. I mean, when you lose a quarterback who had 5,600 yards and 60 pass touchdowns, it's going to be definitely very tough to be able to replace him. But if they can return Clyde Edwards-Helaire, that would be huge for this team. I mean, if they can return him, I think that this team very well has a chance to go on to win the SEC again. I mean, yeah, we're not sure quite yet. We're still only about a week into the offseason. They lose their top wide receiver, Justin Jefferson, to the draft. They do lose 2 offensive linemen, a defensive lineman, and a linebacker, as well as 2 in the secondary. So this defense takes a couple of bad hits as well. They do return their other 2 wide receivers, though, and they still have tons of talent. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this LSU team is bringing in some great recruiting classes, so that's going to be very helpful. But nonetheless, I think this will be more of a rebuilding year for LSU, especially with losing Joe Burrow. I mean, he had such an impact on this program this year. It's crazy. I don't think that they'll make it to the playoff in 2020, but I think they'll be up there for the SEC. Number 3 is Alabama, and they had more of a disappointing 2019, no doubt. But Tua won't be there in 2020, that's for sure. He is going on to the NFL draft. And so Mac Jones will be likely to start the majority of the season, and honestly, he didn't do all that terrible in 2019. Najee Harris at running back might leave as well, though, so you got to note that. But Judy, Ruggs, and Smith, wide receivers, could all go to the draft if they wanted to. Not sure quite yet who will. And they do lose a defensive lineman and a linebacker, but otherwise this defense looks good. So I think for Alabama, they're probably my favorite right now to win the SEC again. But once again, we'll have to see. We're still very early on. Number 2 is Ohio State. They return Justin Fields. J.K. Dobbins will go to the draft. He had over 2,000 yards this season, so he had a big impact on this program. The running back position is going to have a couple of question marks. They lose the wide receiver KJ Hill. They do return their top wide receiver in Olave, though, so that's pretty big. They lose 2 offensive linemen, 2 defensive linemen, a linebacker, and 3 in the secondary as well. So there are a few hits for this team, and it'll be interesting to see how they do. But Ohio State's probably my favorite for the Big Ten right now, though, as well. I mean, Ohio State was in a league of their own for 2019. I think they will be in 2020 as well. I mean, Justin Fields, I think he's got Heisman potential. I mean, he had a really good season. I think he will in 2020 as well. Number 1 is Clemson. The team had finished 2nd this season. Trevor Lawrence has 1 more year with Clemson, so that is huge. And of course, I mean, we already saw in 2018 Trevor Lawrence as a freshman. I mean, man, he had so much potential, and he certainly lived up to it last season. And I think he will once again in 2020. Clemson will probably go on to the College Football Playoff again. But ETN at running back will likely leave along with T. Higgins at wide receiver, so that's going to be rough. But the defense looks really good otherwise. They do lose 2 linebackers, but that's really about it on the defense. They do lose the defensive lineman as well. But for Clemson, I think they'll be just fine in 2020. Really looking forward to seeing how they do, that's for sure, especially Trevor Lawrence. I mean, in his last year of being in college football, I mean, I don't think he'll stay for his senior year. I mean, you'd have to be doubtful to think that. So, I mean, for Trevor Lawrence, with it being his last year, it'll be interesting to see how he performs. But nonetheless, that is it for my 2020 way too early college football rankings. Once again, they're way too early rankings for a reason. These likely will not be very accurate once we get towards August and towards summer. But we'll be doing several other editions of these as we head towards the season. So be sure to stay tuned for those. Show some support if you'd like to. Go ahead and subscribe if you'd like to. I'd really appreciate that. But yeah, thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for more content from All Sports Central. Lots of off-season updates and also some NFL analysis as we're heading towards the Super Bowl in a couple weeks. But yeah, thank you all for watching once again. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I will see you all later.